Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us in this panel. My name is Julia. I'm a manager at Kroll, a division of Health. Kroll is an international consultancy firm that works with intelligence and investigations mainly. Here with me today, I have Andrew Whelan, our London AM Associate Managing Director, and Ian, our Brazil Associate Managing Director. We are part of Kroll's sports practice team, and do basically is investigations and business intelligence and the proactive and reactive services of compliance and checking vendors and checking sponsors and everything. And we also do internal investigations for, we've been working with the Premier League. We have been working with Brazilian clubs and other foreign clubs for a long time, now. And so Kroll is a leading providing risk solutions firm. We are in all of the continents here in the Americas, Europe and Middle East, and also in the Asia Pacific. I think this is it. Could you just give me 1 second? So that I can stop sharing the screen. Oh, great. So, Andrew, could you tell us a little bit about your role at Kroll and how you and your team help sports organizations and football teams in particular in managing risks?
Sure, Julia, I'd be delighted to. And firstly, thank you very much to yourself and Ian for joining us today from Sao Paulo. I know you've been doing some really interesting work in sport over the past couple of years in football, and athletics come to mind. So I'm really excited to hear about your experiences and perspective from the LATAM region this afternoon. So we set up a sports practice out of London about 3.5, 4 years ago. Historically, Kroll has done a fair bit of work in sport, but we could see changes in the sector. It was becoming more professional, a larger amount of money flowing in, increased governance, increased public scrutiny, and all of which felt like there were opportunities for Kroll to help clients. Mm-hmm. So over the past 3.5 years, we've been doing an increasing amount of work in the sector. We've been increasing our connectivity, significantly in football, but also in other sports, such as rugby, cycling, motor racing, athletics, some of the big US sports as well. And we've been helping clubs, investors, and regulators, governing bodies, helping them with their problems. And the type of work we do, broadly speaking, falls into 2 categories. There's the pre-event information gathering, where a club, an investor or regulator or an athlete wants information ahead of a strategic decision. And that could be signing a player, for example. We are, as Kroll, we're not going to advise a football club on how a player can perform on the pitch, but we might be able to provide them with some insight as to their off-field behaviour and activities. We've helped sports organisations ahead of hiring a manager or a director, for example. We've looked at potential sponsors for clubs and regulators ahead of commercial deals. We've looked at potential investors, and that's for sports regulators to support their fit and proper process, or for owners who are considering new investments into the club, either partial investments or completely selling their club. And all of this is about managing risks ahead of the sports organisation making a strategic decision. And very briefly, the second type of work we do for sports organisations is the post-event investigations, so the reactive work rather than the proactive work. And typically, in this case, something has gone wrong. An organisation will contact us and say, this has happened. Can you find out how this has happened? Who was responsible? And often, what can we do about it? For example, cases we've been involved with, leaks of information out of boardrooms or dressing rooms, training grounds, employee wrongdoing and fraud. We've looked at transfer irregularities and the role of agents. We've looked at counterfeiting. We've worked on litigation and dispute support cases. And we've done culture investigations over in the US. But what we are seeing an increasing emphasis on is a desire to understand source of funds. I think over the past 20 years or so, sport has become so much more global. And as a result, there's been an increasing amount of money flowing in to the sector from emerging jurisdictions. And very often, or increasingly, these are funds that are provided or being pro-offered by little or lesser known counterparties. And clubs and regulators are starting to become aware of the risks involved with accepting these funds. So that in summary is the type of work we've been doing for the past few years.
Great. Thank you, Andrew, for the introduction. So I think from what I understand, Kroll is very equipped to assist sports organizations into assessing the sort of funds that can come to them, and whether it is safe or not to get them and to use them, right? So Ian, what do you see are the main differences between what the UK and Europe do and Brazilian sports organizations are doing at this time?
Thank you, Julia, and hello everyone. Good afternoon, good morning for those in Brazil. I know that there are some local partners listening to us as well. Always a pleasure to have this discussion and to join Andrew in talking about sports risks, investigations, and all the matters that we do. And again, as a global firm, we're able to actually have similar type of work, but with, of course, different realities, different risk cultures, and different corporate backgrounds as a whole. So as Andy said, we've been doing this as a firm for about three and a half, 4 years. Not that we didn't do this before, but now with a team of specialists and people who are dedicating sometimes specifically for this industry and all the specifics that it brings. So in Latin America, we've also been doing this for about 3 years now, with a lot of support from our counterparts around the world. And what we see, it is really a different scenario, different types of risks, but at the same time, risks that are unique for this industry. And as we know, specifically talking about Brazil, where we're based, the whole football or sports framework is quite different. You don't have, clubs are still functioning as associations, as non-profit associations. There are a number of regulatory and legal changes going on right now to bring a more professional framework into sports and for clubs to function as a proper corporate. And with that, we hope that the matters such as risk management, governance, compliance are things that will be looked at with more detail, with more care and more attention by all the parties involved. But currently, I think the very big difference between what we do here and what is done elsewhere, specifically in Europe, has to do with how sports organizations, clubs in particular, are organized, and with that, all the challenges in managing risk in a not so regulated environment. And I'll touch on that later on our discussion today. But certainly, challenges are different, although of course with the similarities around the sports, and with that, sponsorship and investment play a big role, especially in the moment that we are right now, with funds being more scarce and a need for everyone involved to still be mindful of the risks on funds and sponsorship.
Great. it's great to hear this this comparison. I think we're going to talk a little bit further about this in a few moments. I wanted to touch based on something that Ian said, Andrew, and I think we can all agree. These are very difficult times for all sports organizations, right? When they're experiencing a decrease in income from match days and from merchandising. Some clubs are losing contracts at all. And so what I wanted to ask is there a risk of them being less careful when establishing relationships with sponsors or investors? And what could be the consequences of the lack of care?
Thank you, Julia. It's a very good question. I think what I would say is that it is likely that very few businesses in sport and in other sectors will emerge unscathed certainly in the short to medium term from COVID-19. In sport, there are currently, because of what's happened, and there will be going forward, increasing pressures on organisations, particularly the longer this situation goes on, to bring in new sources of funds to compensate for the loss of the more traditional revenue streams, such as gate receipts, match day merchandising, etc. And also in football and some of the other sports as well, some clubs have built their entire business model around player transfers and shrewd recruitments and selling on at a profit. And transfer values appear to be decreasing. Fewer transfers, big transfers, have seemed to be happening in the recent pre-season. While at the same time salary costs are remaining high and fixed costs are high. So I think we've seen over recent years that football clubs have been looking further, and all sports organisations have been looking further afield than ever for revenue streams. We saw it first with investment into organisations. We saw the big wave coming in from Eastern Europe, and then from the US, then from the Far East. We're seeing more again from the US. It goes through phases, and we've also seen it with sponsorship. We can see now that probably half of the shirt sponsors of football clubs in the top levels of the UK footballing pyramid are gambling sponsors, and these are not known, these organisations aren't known to people in the UK. They're marketed towards an overseas customer base for people watching the sport overseas, so a certain part of the global audience. So when money's flowing in from these emerging jurisdictions, it's often from countries where there is a paucity or a lack of reliable publicly available information. And as a result, there can be an information gap between what the recipient organisation ought to know and what they can find out through just routine desktop checks. However, at the same time, there's regulatory and public scrutiny increasing. So given this change of jurisdictional emphasis, and I can only see that continuing, allied with this increase in regulatory and public scrutiny, it feels really important now for sports organisations to know who it is they're partnering with. What is the source of wealth and funds of these companies that the sports clubs are going to be endorsing in the stadium or on the shirts? How clean and legitimate are these funds that are going to be flowing into the sports organisation's bank account? And does this business really exist in the form that it purports to? Or is this business simply a mechanism to launder funds? And allied to this, there's also ethical and reputational practices to consider when you're dealing with unknown counterparties, which I think, like I say, is going to be a trend that's going to be increasing. In recent years outside of sport, we've seen lots of examples where an ethical scandal has damaged the value of a business. And sport isn't immune to that. We saw it touched upon in lockdown here in the UK when some of the football clubs furloughed their non-playing staff, and they got a lot of criticism in the media for it, and they quickly took steps to rectify it. And we've also seen that in terms of source of funds and reputation. There's been a number of examples where sponsorship deals have been terminated partway through, or an investor into a club has turned out to be involved in questionable activities in their homeland. And that's had really detrimental consequences, both financially and reputationally, for the club or the organisation. So just emphasising the importance of this, I did a case a while ago where we worked on behalf of a football club and we looked at an overseas sponsor from an emerging jurisdiction, and we identified some monetary and ethical issues involved with it. Our client declined to do this sponsorship deal, but other football clubs did do the sponsorship deal. Subsequently, during the same season, that sponsor was investigated by regulators, and as a result of the regulatory and public scrutiny, those clubs then terminated the sponsorship deal, and they likely lost revenues as a result of that. It probably would have been halfway through, well, it was halfway through a season. This might have been a 3-season sponsorship deal. So they might have lost 2.5 years worth of revenue, depending on how the deal was structured. And also, when it was in the press, those clubs were linked with it. So it didn't really reflect well reputationally or on their business practices. So yeah, I think there is. I think clubs are going to be looking further and further, and all sports organisations are going to be looking further and further afield for revenue streams.
And so, and Andy, how much of that do you think is regulatory driven as opposed to business driven?
Business driven in terms of internal business decisions, or just the wider business environment?
Yeah, the business environment. I mean, how much is it an industry effort, and how much is it regulatory driven? Because I mean, and I wanted to touch on that in Latin America later on, because I think this is probably a big difference.
Yeah. So what I would say is, I don't think we can see from where I sit, we for a good number of years now, we've had more regulated work from more regulated industries come to us regarding source of funds, such as the financial services industry, recently from gambling companies, all looking to understand the source of funds of customers that is flowing into that organization. And that is very much regulatory driven. I think with sport, it feels a little bit behind that in that sense. There doesn't seem to be the same sort of regulatory demand from sporting regulators. But then, as our previous speaker said, if you're dealing, for example, in US dollars, then there's considerations there, because then you've got the US authorities you have to consider. So really, there are wider regulatory pressures that I think are coming in, are bearing down on sporting organisations. But also with sports, there's such an intense public scrutiny. So any of these, any tainted source of funds, even if it isn't necessarily a regulatory issue, it's going to create publicity, which doesn't necessarily reflect well for the organisation.
Sure.
And I think this matches with the recent request from all markets for more transparency, right? And we can see that, especially in the sports industry, how far behind we are in respect to the transparency if you compare them with other industries. And then Ian, Andrew spoke a little bit about the issues sponsors have brought to certain sports organizations, and we have a few of those examples in the Brazilian and Latin American markets as well. So I just wanted to ask you, how do you see the current challenges brought by the pandemic affecting how clubs should manage their risks when assessing sources of funds? Regarding that, we also experienced the same issues in Europe regarding the source of funds.
Sure, and I think Andrew has touched in some very interesting and important aspects of what the crisis has brought in terms of limited funds. For example, in Brazil and elsewhere in Latin America, some of the leagues have resumed but they're still playing behind closed doors, which of course affects a very important source of funds for match day and gate income. And of course, with the pandemic, with the crisis, every single business has been affected, and with that, the funds available for sponsorship in particularly have been affected. So we know of clubs who have, deals canceled right now, where of course, they needed it the most, and some of these are now being taken to court because you have sponsors who basically had to forfeit sponsorship deals and so on. So I think it is, of course, the whole economy that has been affected, and with that, funds for the sports organizations. But with that, I think it comes a very, a cultural aspect of business in Latin America, is that not much will be done until you have regulatory enforcement, and until clubs are forced either by regulations or by business, and this is what I was asking Andy to understand the environment in Europe, to implement proper governance, compliance, appropriate controls. Very little will be done. So there's one initiative in Brazil. It has been around for a number of years now, about 5 years if I'm not mistaken, which is a group of very large companies. They are all sports sponsors, and they have created a framework by which any sports organization that has any sort of sponsorship deals with them, they have to comply with a number of rules. So it is not regulatory enforced, but it is business enforced. So you have financial services players, you have transport, you have regulated players who are sponsors, and of course they have regulatory requirements themselves. For example, a bank has to comply with an infinity of regulations, and they now want clubs sponsored by them to have proper governance, to have the appropriate controls. And I think it is really important that the industry itself creates these obligations if they are not coming from a regulation. In general, we have. Sorry, Andy.
No, sorry. Carry on, please. Ian.
Yeah. We have seen risk management as a cost in Brazil, and in sport even more because of the lack of regulation. And from our experience, we can see that this lack of control, the lack of proper governance around investments, the lack of investment and attention to risk management has hurt clubs not only financially, but even it will have a prolonged impact even in their sporting performance, because the more the problems are kept under the radar, the more shady deals are made with sponsors who may not fulfill their sponsorship obligations or may have reputational issues that will affect the club later on. We have seen this. We have seen, very top-rated clubs being relegated within 2 or 3 seasons because suddenly, the whole framework has fallen. So it is quite serious. And at the same time, we keep seeing, for example, a number of years ago, a first division club in Brazil was sponsored, but what ultimately was discovered, it was a Ponzi scheme or a pyramid scheme. So, and they actually were like the top sponsors for that club. So again, I think if you add, the lack of funds, and of course clubs being desperate for funds, and a lack of proper risk management, I think it is really the perfect storm in terms of what can happen with a club without the proper controls in place.
Ian, that's really interesting. Just coming back to a point you mentioned earlier, were you saying that there's sometimes the sponsors are the ones who are conducting the due diligence on the clubs before doing these deals?
Exactly. Yeah. We've seen this in Brazil, and I think it is probably the opposite to what happened elsewhere. Clubs in Latin America, and of course in Brazil, where we operate the most, Julia and I, we have seen clients coming to us, and these are not the clubs looking for a due diligence work or wanting to understand more about a potential sponsor or investor, but it's actually the investor needing to understand, because of their own policies, their own compliance framework, they have to understand what is the risk in investing in that particular club, not only because of other investments that one club may have, but also the political, relations, the whole internal politics of the club. And because clubs are operating in an association model in Brazil, you may have political groups within the club, fighting each other before an election, for example, before an internal election of the club. You may have a lot of relationships between club officials and elected officials from the city or the state where they're based. And because of that, we have been reached out by sponsors and investors wanting to understand more about these risks before investing in a particular sport organization. So yes, it has happened.
Interesting. I mean, it's a very relevant point, because not so long ago we were contacted by a well-known brand that was considering investing in a European football club, and they wanted to understand the risks of this investment because of the politicized ownership. And I was wondering if this is going to be a trend that we're seeing here in Europe.
Yes, I understand that it is, if you could say, a two-way thing. I mean, clubs need to understand more about the risks of a particular investor, but I think the other way around is also is what we're seeing in Brazil. It is the fact that clubs could potentially be a high-risk investment for the investor, and so you see the opposite type of a risk management framework in place from the investors. So yeah,
absolutely.
Yes, and I think this is directly connected to what we said a bit earlier about the lack of transparency there are in sports organizations in general. We have here in Brazil most sports organizations, you really cannot have public access to a lot of relevant information that so we are usually hired to try to understand the environment around this club, to see that so the sponsor can be sure if he enters the club, right? So if he's a partner of this club, he will be safe of reputational risk mostly. And Andrew, I read an article of yours recently where you mentioned a very interesting case of an investigation into a manufacturing firm in an emerging jurisdiction, and then on behalf of the club, right? And you found out that the manufacturing firm actually didn't really exist. Can you tell us a little bit more about that case?
Yeah, sure. And that's correct. So we were engaged by, again, a football club to conduct a source of funds review on a manufacturing company. It was based in the Far East. And when we did our initial look at this company, it looked fine. Initial searches on the internet showed it appeared to have a high profile. It looked credible. It had a particularly distinguished non-executive board. It had former politicians on the board, not just from the local country, but also from the West. So politicians we know over here. It had other well-known individuals on the board. It had a high-profile investor base, including some really well-known celebrities. And the first couple of pages of Google, there were lots of positive media about this company, about its growth and its expansion plans overseas. But obviously, we're paid to delve deeper. And what we found was much of this information was self-generated. So the company was producing press releases. These press releases were being picked up and repeated by the local media, and there was very little independent reporting. Most of the plans, the expansion plans that they'd announced, hadn't materialized. There was no evidence that the plans to build factories in these various countries had ever happened. And so we started looking at the owners, or the main owner in particular. And what we could see is that there was a couple of failed businesses in his background. And it looked like this individual had gone from one business to the other, and this was his current enterprise. And in his wake, he'd left behind a number of really disgruntled investors and disputes with business partners. So we uncovered litigation, historical litigation. We found a historical bankruptcy, which was really interesting in itself because the actual business wasn't owned by the main principal, the guy who was the front of the company and was named in all the media reports and the press releases. His wife actually owned it, and that probably accounted for the reason why he had this historical bankruptcy. And then we also found the start of some live litigation where he was being sued by some of the current investors, including some of those high-profile celebrities. So we wanted to really get to the bottom of, is this business operational? Does it really exist anymore? So we literally sent somebody to the factory on an industrial estate in this country to look through the windows and just see what was going on, like literally look through the windows. And they could see that it was pretty much empty. It wasn't operational. And they spoke to a local cleaner who was on this industrial estate. And they explained that it hadn't been operational for months and that they often saw people coming around here looking for the owner and asking questions. So clearly this business did not exist in the form that it was purporting to at that current time to our clients. And so we started speaking to people in the country, investors in the business, former business associates, people with knowledge of the sector in which this business operated, and people were repeatedly using the words Ponzi scheme and fraud. Wow. So our client obviously didn't go ahead with this deal. And we inferred that the owner wanted this relationship with the football club to boost the profile of the business, which would in turn increase its chances of getting investment, and that would kind of fuel and perpetuate this Ponzi scheme. And just kind of on a final note, because it was such a high profile, it had so many high profile individuals involved. It's, for example, on its non-exec board, and some of its investors were newsworthy individuals in their own right. This company has blown up, and it's since been in the media because it was sued. Oh, wow. And our client's name hasn't been associated with it because they didn't go ahead with the deal because of the work we did. But had they done that deal, had they not tried to understand the provenance and the source of these funds and the reputation of the company, every media article would have probably said, X company, a sponsor of this particular football club, and there would have been this association, which just wouldn't have looked good. So not only would there have been a direct commercial impact, as in the sponsorship revenue probably would have dried up, but also there is a reputational impact there as well.
Wow.
This is really interesting, and I think again it highlights the importance of the preventative type work instead of reactive. And I think this is the type of approach that we always try to develop with our clients. So and of course I'm sure it was a much more productive way to do it rather than dealing with all the consequences from a reputational or even from a legal perspective that they would have faced. But with that, of course, comes an initial investment and the organization in question being proactive in managing this reputational risk. Right?
Absolutely, and similarly, we did a case looking at an investor into a sports club. And this investor purported to be worth the best part of the equivalent of $1 billion. And he provided a letter of good standing from a bank. And again, we looked at this investor. Actually, one of the things that really jumped out was this individual was supposed to be worth $1 billion, but had a very little profile. So it was the opposite situation to the previous case. And that in itself started ringing a few alarm bells. If you're worth $1 billion, you'd think you'd have some sort of profile, but we just couldn't find anything. Anyway, more and more red flags started coming to light when we started looking at this individual. And eventually we decided to really get to the bottom of what was going on with this source of this letter of good standing purporting to be worth $1 billion. Had a look at it, and it was from a bank, and we could see that the name of this bank no longer existed at the date at which this letter was purportedly produced. It had been taken over by another bank, and have been renamed. So we called that bank and asked her to speak to the individual who was named on the letter as a signatory. And the bank said that this person had left a couple of years previously. This bank had been taken over. This individual left at the same time. So we tracked down that signatory and we said, do you know this business person? And the signatory said, I've never come across that person. They've never had an account with me. So this was clearly a fraudulent letter, which was purporting to be worth $1 billion to try and buy into a sport club.
We have a similar example in Brazil, right? Of a case we contacted, Ian.
Yes, we did. About 2 years ago, one of our clients, and again, the different environment that we had here, that club was actually at election mode. So basically, there was a dispute between two candidates for the role of president of the club. And in these types of organizations, the president actually runs the club as sometimes, similar to what a politician would. And that particular club had a healthy and I would say high-profile deal with a particular sponsor. And the opposing candidate promised that, brought a number of issues about that sponsorship and promised that he would bring a new sponsor to replace this one sponsorship deal that they already had. He didn't win. The current, the current president continued and was reelected, but the candidate who lost said that anyway he would bring that name to the club's board for it to be analyzed, and we were hired to do a very similar piece of work that you just mentioned, looking at the letters and the background of this particular sponsor who no one had heard of, but allegedly was a $1 billion corporation based in Far East Asia. And our work with our Crow colleagues in Asia was actually to run checks on them to understand what their activities were, and the whole connections and source of funds. And very similar story. It ended up that some documents were not legit, and basically it was a political move at the time of the election that ended up being completely false. Again, it saved the club a lot in terms of reputation and legal costs if that deal had gone up. So absolutely. Yes, we see that. I would say that at the moment, at least 80% of what we do is reactive. The number of proactive type work in Latin America is still very small compared to the number of times that we are called after the event or after the issue.
Interesting.
And the club also didn't end the contract with a very good sponsor as well, which was working very well.
Exactly.
Guys, I think we are about to end our time here. We still had a couple of questions, but unfortunately, I think we are close to ending our time here. So I wanted to thank both of you for joining us, and I wanted to thank ABC Mind Sports for having us. It's been it always is a very interesting conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd also like to thank you both for joining us from Sao Paulo. Again, thank ABC Minds for the platform. And if anybody has any questions or would like to discuss with us anything we've spoken about today or any other issues, please do contact us through this platform or offline. We're going to be available all afternoon for networking, and hopefully look forward to speaking with some of you further. Thank you.